Hi, this is David Lucas, and I'm glad you're here. This video is a supplement to the original broadcast that aired on our affiliate station, KARN 102.9 News Radio in Central Arkansas. Many of you may be listening from our podcast or other sources, but this video covers how banks make money. So you're going to want to listen to that broadcast if you're watching this video, because this is really a supplement. Then again, much of what you will learn here will explain what was talked about on that broadcast, but if you really want to grasp these concepts, you may want to listen to the broadcast if you're watching this video first, or vice versa. So, how do banks make money? This is a very nebulous or vague topic to the average consumer. They don't understand. They don't know how banking works. So, how do banks make money? Well, let's explore this. First of all, let's go back in history a little bit. I'm going to change this. We're working with just a basic rate calculator that's going to solve for an unknown. So we're going to say interest rates in the 1980s. Well, there we go. Interest rates in the 1980s. Well, one thing we know is yields on CDs were much higher. I don't think anyone would disagree with that in the decade of the 80s. So the yields banks would pay on CDs bounced around, but it settled somewhere around 9%. So that's what that represents there, the present value. So if you put $100 in your local bank, they're going to have to pay you $9 for a year in interest on that money. Well, if you deposit that $100, or I should say if you go borrow that same $100, or another consumer borrows the same $100 from the same exact bank, commercial loans or consumer loans at the time were around 15%. So just to be sure we're clear here, 9% is what a bank would pay on CD yields, deposits held with the banking depository institution. 15 is what they would charge consumers who wanted to borrow from the very same bank. So most people, when you ask them here, you stop here and you say, what would this bank make? What would their profit margin be? What would their rate of return be? And most people would typically say, well, if they're going to make 15% and it's costing them 9%, there's a 6% spread, 6% between these two, they're making 6%. And this is very important here. Nothing could be further from the truth. Over 1 year, there's a 66.67% markup on the money. And this is no different if you go to the local home improvement store and you buy a hammer or whatever it may be, and they mark up the price for a profit. So you may be wondering why this is. Now let's dive in a little further, and this is very important to understand. So we're going to duplicate this calculator here. So there's the late 80s. And we'll come over here and we'll call this without So we're going to name this calculator, same rate calculator, without leverage, other people's money. You see, one thing that it took me a while to understand, and many of us don't understand, is that leverage works in the same way in finance that it does in physics. So the reason why banks make so much money, and it's the most profitable business in the world, is simply because they're using other people's money. Because of our fractional reserve banking system, if someone deposits $100, that same $100 at that bank, you see the bank doesn't have to keep that full $100 in deposit for you. They only have to keep roughly 10%. It's different for different size banks, but let's use the 10% reserve ratio. In which case, that means that the banks are not loaning out their money, they're loaning out your money. And this is important. So it would be true if the bank was using their money. Let's explore this. If they had to loan out $100 of their money, not your money, because remember, banks don't loan out their own money. They only have to keep 10% of all deposits on hand for demand if someone requests it. The rest simply isn't there. In many cases, they do not have to do that. They use other people's money. So if they loan out their own money and they pay it back and they get paid back at $115, again, they loan out $100 of their money and they receive $115 in return, over 1 year, this is a 15% return. This is oftentimes what most people think how banks make money. So, but the reality is why banks make so much money is because they're not lending out their money. They're lending out the deposits of other people depositing their funds at that bank. I know it sounds hard to believe. If many of you aren't familiar, some of you watching this may not understand how banks make, or how fractional reserve lending works, and you'll want to refer to other videos or resources that I've provided on previous shows to cover that topic in great detail. Lastly, next to last I should say, let me duplicate another calculator here. And what happened in the late 80s and early 90s? Alan Greenspan, many of you will recall at the time, was the Fed chairman, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. What was the main thing that was happening during this period? Banks were falling or dropping like flies. The Republic Bank of Texas, one of the largest banks at the time in the country, failed. Banks were falling, financial institutions were failing. So Greenspan came in and artificially drove rates down and said, you know what, we're going to stimulate consumer spending, encourage borrowing, drive rates down, and therefore this will help the banks. So let's look at that. Now all of a sudden, CD rates drop to around 3%. All right, and now the future value of, or what we should say is, consumer loans fall from 15% over here, right, down to 9%. Now, this is key here. You look at these two and you say 9 from 15 is 6, 3 from 9 is 6. The banks, the cost of money should remain exactly the same. And to be quite frank with you, many people in banking do not even understand this concept, the cost of money. So I'm going to show you what actually bailed out the banks during the S&L crisis when banks were failing left and right. So he drove interest rates down over that same 1 year. Now that we know, because of leverage, using other people's money, they're only renting the money. It cost them $3 to get use and control of $100 of someone else's money, right? They're renting it, and they're renting it for $3, and they're getting $9 in return. Over 1 year, that's a 200% profit the banks made by driving rates down. So it wasn't the consumer spending and more loans. It was the cost of money to the banks and what they could turn around and mark it up. Now all of a sudden there's a 200% markup. Very interesting. Very telling. Now, one other thing I want to mention here. Many of us remember TARP, right? The Troubled Asset Relief Program. They started handing out billions of dollars to banks in the name of encouraging them to lend out money to consumers. And here's what happened. All right, so if all of a sudden the banks could borrow directly from the Federal Reserve at 0.25 or 0.50, why would they take a risk on Smo Joe out on Main Street when they could go around and dump in Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasuries? This is just an exercise in financial education to give you the big idea. I'm not saying the 2.4 is the exact Treasury yield, but it was somewhere around there. So now all of a sudden, look, 380%, or if their cost of funds, which they were getting at almost zero from the Fed, all of a sudden there's an 800% plus profit if they just turn around and dump those in safe, secure Treasury bonds. Now, why would they want to take a risk on the American public when they can make that kind of profit? So it's very important to know what bailed out the banks. It wasn't the consumer spending, it was the cost of money, because Alan Greenspan and the Fed drove rates, the bank's margins, from something like this over to something more like this. Now, lastly here, we want to take a look at one last equation in this scenario, and that would be, let's pull up a future value calculator here. Basic future value financial calculator. And let's we'll call this, well, we don't even need to rename it. We'll just leave it at future value. All right, so if interest rates rise back to more historic levels of, let's say, the 9% that we had at one time, if interest rates go back to 9, what banks have to pay on deposit when people deposit their money, again, that 9% represents what a bank might pay on a CD. The question becomes, in order to retain that 200% profit margin that banks are experiencing, and in reality, if we base this on what they're paying their deposit holders, what they're charging on a commercial loan, it could be a little lower than this, but the concepts are exactly the same. If they're paying you 1% and they're charging 6% on a commercial loan, now you see the profit margins even skyrocket higher. Banks are making unprecedented amounts of money. Now, and I should say, also I want to be clear here, oftentimes we need to separate the small community banks who have suffered somewhat versus the larger banks. Many of them I talk about in my book, Too Big to Fail. Those whose management believe themselves wholly exempt from bankruptcy and believe that there's an explicit, unspoken guarantee that any losses will be socialized. I mean, we get to pay for it, but they get to keep the profits. So therefore, lastly, if rates return to higher levels, as they have been certainly in the past, and history will certainly repeat itself, in order for banks to maintain this higher profit margin, let's just be conservative and say 200 over 1 year, how much interest are they going to have to charge? 27%. Are we going to be that foolish? Well, I don't know. Some people are paying that on credit cards, some consumers. So I hope that this has given you an idea of how banks make money. It's very important that you understand this concept because you can apply many of the same principles in your life. And I'll leave you with this. Who controls the banking equation in your life? It's like I talk about in my book. I have a chapter called The Banking Equation. The reality is that if you don't understand these things, you will be enslaved to a system that has been built to keep you coming back for more year after year, when the average American, a large majority, 20 to 30% or more of their income is going out the door to the financial institutions. So once you understand these banking principles, and specifically the power of leveraging your resources, then you can apply these same principles. This is not common knowledge. This is not what's taught by the dogma out of Wall Street and the average advisor propagating the typical qualified plan and other common strategies. Until you understand these principles, you will find yourself frustrated, and unfortunately, many Americans will find themselves separated from their hard-earned money. Again, to recap what we just talked about, how banks make money. If you'd like to learn more and how to implement these same banking principles in your life, I highly encourage you to pick up my book, Whose Future Are You Financing? What the Government and Wall Street Don't Want You to Know. You can pick up your copy if you just simply go on over to dlshowonline.com, and on the homepage there you'll see the banner for my book. So you can learn how to turn the banking equation in your favor and create your own privatized financing system and personal monetary system. Thank you for watching this video.